Long before anyone imagined a starship folding space to leap between suns, storytellers had already learned how to make impossible distance feel close enough to touch. This episode begins there, in that older habit of shrinking the world on the page, before speed itself became a modern kind of magic. If this drift into old maps and older stories feels like your kind of place, leave a comment with the impossible journey you first believed as a child, and consider liking or subscribing for more restful history. Picture a reader in a dim parlor, lamp turned low, a borrowed book open across the knees. The story inside promises a journey no living person could actually make, a carpet that lifts off the floor and carries its passenger over mountains in a single held breath, or a hidden valley tucked behind a waterfall where a lost people have lived untouched by centuries. The reader does not pause to ask how the carpet flies. The story has already taught them the rule of its own world, and they accept it the way one accepts a dream mid-dream, simply because the telling feels steady and sure. This is the quiet inheritance that faster-than-light travel would later draw from, whether its future writers knew it or not. Long before anyone wrote of engines that outrun light, audiences already knew how to trust a shortcut if the story around it felt confident. Fairy journeys, moon voyages, and lost world adventures were not scientific documents, and no one mistook them for engineering, but they trained generations of readers in a very particular skill, the willingness to let distance collapse the moment a narrator claimed it could. Moon voyages in particular carried a strange double life. Some were told as satire, using the vast gap between Earth and the Moon as a way to comment on kings, philosophers, or the vanity of empire, with the journey itself treated almost as a joke, a rhetorical device rather than a technical claim. Others leaned toward wonder for its own sake, describing floating cities or crystalline landscapes with the same hushed excitement a traveler might use describing a real foreign port. In both cases, the actual mechanism of travel mattered far less than the emotional truth being delivered once the traveler arrived. The moon was less a physical destination than an excuse to stand somewhere impossibly far away and look back. Lost World tales performed a related trick, though pointed sideways rather than upward. Instead of vaulting into the sky, they hid vast distances inside ordinary geography, tucking a forgotten civilization behind a jungle ridge or beneath a desert no map quite agreed on. The thrill was not simply arrival, but the idea that unmeasured space could still exist somewhere on a supposedly fully charted globe. That, too, is a kind of shortcut, not compressing the miles themselves, but suggesting that some miles had simply never been properly counted in the first place. What ties these older forms together is not accuracy, but confidence in delivery. A magic carpet, a satirical moon-bound philosopher, a valley no explorer had mapped. None of them needed a mechanism a reader could test at home. They needed only a narrator who did not blink, and a story that moved forward at a steady pace, so the impossible could slide past almost unnoticed, wrapped inside a more immediate concern, such as a rescue, a rivalry, or a joke at the expense of the powerful. Then, across the 19th century, something in the ordinary world began to catch up with that old narrative confidence, and the shortcut stopped feeling purely magical. The electric telegraph, developed and expanded across the middle decades of the century, allowed a message to cross a continent or an ocean in a span of time that would have seemed miraculous only a generation earlier. For more than 100 years afterward, the telegraph remained a principal way that printed information moved swiftly by wire and later by radio wave, turning what had once required weeks of sailing into something closer to an afternoon's wait. This was not fiction. It was a working system, humming along ordinary wires, and its very ordinariness is what made it so useful to storytellers looking for a bridge between old wonder and new plausibility. Rail travel offered a companion transformation, less instantaneous than the telegraph, but just as psychologically important, because it changed how far a single day of travel could actually carry a person. Distances that had once demanded weeks of hard road could now be measured in scheduled hours, timetables printed and consulted like sacred texts. Speed itself, in other words, had become something a reader could personally verify, simply by comparing a grandparent's account of a journey with their own. When a storyteller later proposed that some future or foreign transport might move even faster still, the leap required from the reader was noticeably smaller than it had been a century before. Jules Verne, publishing in the same decades that saw the telegraph network expand and the rail lines multiply, understood exactly how to use that shrinking gap between wonder and plausibility. His story of a circumnavigation completed in 80 days, serialized in the early 1870s, and soon collected into a book that readers across languages devoured, built its entire premise on a newspaper report describing a new rail line that made such a rapid trip around the globe seem, for the first time, theoretically possible. The novel did not ask readers to believe in magic. It asked them to believe in a hypothetical acceleration of things they already trusted: trains, steamships, and printed schedules. That single shift from enchanted shortcut to engineered shortcut is one of the most important hinges in this whole prehistory. Verne's earlier balloon adventure, describing a journey across a continent's width carried aloft on a single sustained flight, worked by a similar logic, though gentler in its claims. A balloon was real. Sustained transcontinental flight by balloon at the scale he described was not something ordinary travelers had done, yet it sat close enough to real ballooning that readers could imagine it as a stretched possibility rather than a fantasy plucked from nowhere. Balloon, rail, telegraph, each was a genuine technology, exaggerated only slightly, and each retrained readers to expect that tomorrow's transport might simply be an intensified version of today's. By the final decades of the 19th century, this appetite for speed had itself become a marketable pleasure, distributed openly through the same expanding culture of cheap printing that carried Verne's serials abroad. Mass circulation magazines multiplied across Britain, America, and the European continent, filling their pages with adventure fiction, illustrated travel accounts, and increasingly speculative journeys into futures built from extrapolated machinery. Readers who once needed a magic carpet's confident narrator now had an entire industry of contemporary technology to lean on instead, and the two habits, old wonder and new engineering, sat comfortably side by side on the very same page. It is out of this layered inheritance, part fairy tale, part timetable, that science fiction as a distinct and nameable genre began to take shape in the final years of the century and the earliest years of the next. The genre's later historians tend to place its true emergence in exactly this window, a period thick with both magazine culture and technological confidence. What its earliest writers carried forward was not a single borrowed trick, but a whole toolkit: satire's willingness to travel anywhere for a punchline, adventure fiction's hidden valleys, and the telegraph's proof that distance itself could, under the right conditions, simply stop mattering. So when the first tentative stories of travel between the stars finally appeared, their authors were not inventing the idea of an impossible shortcut from nothing. They were reaching into a toolbox readers already trusted, one stocked with carpets, moons, lost valleys, humming wires, and punctual trains, and beginning to ask a slightly larger, slightly stranger question. What happens when the shortcut stops leading merely across the world and starts reaching toward the stars themselves? So the shortcut had already proven itself close to home, in trains that arrived on schedule and wires that carried voices faster than any horse could ride. The next step, once storytellers began reaching toward the stars, was smaller than it might seem. It was not a leap into pure invention. It was a decision to keep asking the same practical question that had worked so well on Earth. How exactly does one get from here to there? That question, applied to the space between worlds, is where the paper trail of faster-than-light travel quietly begins. For most of the 19th century, a journey to another planet did not need an explanation at all. A dream could carry a traveler to the moon. A trance could deposit a sleeper on Mars. These were marvelous voyages in the oldest sense, stories where the destination mattered far more than the mechanism, and where readers were not expected to ask how the crossing happened, only to enjoy that it had happened at all. This was not a failure of imagination. It was simply a different kind of story, closer in spirit to a fable than to an engineering report, and it had served readers well for a long time. By the final decades of the century, that comfortable vagueness began to change. Writers working in what we would now call early scientific romance started treating travel beyond Earth as something that ought to be accounted for, even if the accounting was speculative, even if it borrowed more confidence than the science of the day could fully support. One clear example is John Jacob Astor's 1894 romance of the future, which imagined travel among the planets by way of a proposed form of propulsion dressed in the careful language of contemporary physics. It is a useful marker, not because it was necessarily first in any absolute sense, but because it shows a specific and telling habit, a writer reaching for scientific vocabulary, however imperfect, instead of reaching for a dream. That habit did not appear in isolation, and it did not belong to any single author working alone in a study late at night. Scholars who have studied Victorian-era speculative fiction have noted how closely these stories were tangled up with the scientific culture of their moment. Writers were reading the same popular science essays their audiences were reading, sometimes in the very same journals. They absorbed talk of unseen forces, invisible mediums, and theoretical fields, the way earlier generations had absorbed talk of magic and omens. When a story needed to move a character from one world to another, the author increasingly reached for whatever explanatory language felt current, testing whether readers would accept a scientific gesture in place of a purely magical one, and finding, often enough, that they would. The most important of these gestures, for our purposes, involves a concept that has since vanished from serious physics but that shaped an extraordinary amount of early speculative writing: the ether. In the science of the period, the ether was imagined as an invisible substance filling all of space, a medium through which light and other forces were thought to travel. It was not a fictional invention. It was a working scientific hypothesis, taken seriously enough that respected publications continued to explore its properties well into the early 20th century, including serious discussions of ether vortices as a physical phenomenon worth investigating in its own right. When a physicist can publish an article treating gravitational waves as a kind of vortex within the ether, it becomes far easier to understand why a novelist might imagine a ship slipping into a similar vortex to cross the gap between stars. The line between speculative science and speculative fiction at this particular moment was thinner than we might now assume, and writers walked back and forth across it freely. Would be tempting to say that one specific ether-based image, one particular vortex or tube described in one particular story, single-handedly launched the entire tradition of faster-than-light travel in fiction. That would be a satisfying story, the kind with a clean beginning and a single author to credit. It would also be more certainty than the evidence allows. What we can say with more confidence is that across roughly the 1890s into the early 1900s, a noticeable cluster of writers began reaching for explanatory shortcuts of this general kind, independently or semi-independently, in response to a shared scientific atmosphere rather than a single shared source. Historians who have catalogued the science fiction of this era in the popular magazines of the time, in works focused specifically on the years bridging the turn of the century, describe a landscape thick with these speculative mechanisms, arriving from many pens at roughly the same historical moment. The pattern looks less like a single invention passed hand to hand, and more like several writers independently discovering that readers wanted their marvels explained, even loosely, even in language that would later be quietly discarded by the science it borrowed from. This matters more than it might first appear, because the explanation itself was never really the point. A vortex in the ether, a mysterious tube through space, a projectile fired with theoretically calculated force, none of these needed to be correct physics to do their narrative job. Their job was to reassure the reader that the story was still playing by some kind of rule, even a borrowed and temporary one. The presence of an explanation, however shaky, changed the emotional register of the journey. It moved the story from once upon a time towards something closer to according to the latest thinking, which is a very different promise to make to a reader, even when both promises ultimately involve a spaceship crossing an unimaginable distance. It is worth pausing on why this shift happened when it did, rather than earlier or later. The late 19th century was a period in which ordinary people were watching real technology visibly compress distance through rail networks, transoceanic cables, and expanding telegraph lines that carried messages across continents in moments. A reader in this period had first-hand experience of previously unthinkable journeys becoming almost mundane, almost boring in the space of a single lifetime. It is not a difficult step to imagine that same reader wanting the leap between worlds to feel like an extension of that same modern momentum, rather than a fairy tale imported from an older, less mechanical age. The ether, the vortex, the tube, these were simply the vocabulary available at the time for describing that extension. They gave the impossible distance between planets and eventually between stars the flavor of an engineering problem rather than a wish granted by magic or dreamed into being by a sleeping traveler. None of this means that wonder disappeared from these stories. If anything, the opposite occurred. Wonder was preserved and even sharpened because it was now wonder built on top of a claim the reader could half believe, argue with, or enjoy testing against what they already understood or thought they understood about the universe around them. That interplay between belief and doubt is arguably the real birthplace of the genre's later long relationship with faster-than-light travel, more than any specific gadget described in any specific tale from this early and uneven period. So the honest answer to when fiction first treated travel among the stars as a problem of transit rather than pure fantasy is not a single date or a single author's name. It is a period, roughly the 1890s through the early 1900s, during which several writers, drawing on a shared and shifting scientific imagination, began building explanatory bridges between worlds instead of simply wishing their characters across the gap. Those bridges were often flawed, resting on physics that would not survive the coming decades of experiment and revision. But the habit they established, the expectation that a journey between worlds deserved some kind of mechanism, however speculative, would outlast the specific ether-based language that first gave it shape and would carry forward into every later generation of star-spanning fiction. That habit needed somewhere to grow, and it would soon find a home in a new kind of publication built specifically to feed an audience hungry for exactly this blend of daring and explanation. That home turned out to be a very particular kind of publication, built not for prestige or permanence, but for cheap wood pulp paper and the economics of a newly literate working public. In the first half of the 20th century, pulp fiction magazines became a genuine mass-market form, made possible by inexpensive printing and by readers who wanted entertainment they could buy for pocket change and carry home after a long shift. The paper itself was rough and acidic, prone to yellowing and crumbling within a few years, and that fragility mattered more than it might seem. These magazines were never meant to sit on a shelf like a novel. They were meant to be read quickly, passed along, and replaced by next month's issue. That disposability shaped the culture growing up around them. A story about ether tubes or vortex travel did not need to last forever. It only needed to satisfy for one sitting, and then send a reader back to the newsstand to see what came next. That rhythm of anticipation is where the shortcut through space began to take root as something shared rather than singular. A magazine, unlike a standalone novel, arrived on a schedule. Readers came to expect installments, sequels, and the return of favorite authors, which meant an idea introduced in one issue had a real chance of being revisited, refined, or simply reused a month or two later. If a writer's ether vortex journey sold well, an editor had every incentive to commission something similar, often from the same author, whose name on the cover became its own kind of promise. The specifics of any single editor's reasoning are not documented, so this remains a reconstruction, but the general pattern follows naturally from how the pulp business worked. Success at the newsstand was the only signal that mattered, and success meant repetition. Repetition is what let an idea calcify into a convention. A single writer imagining a tube through the ether was an isolated fantasy, however clever, but a magazine that printed several such stories across several months from several authors working in a shared house style was doing something else entirely. It was teaching its audience what to expect from a whole category of fiction. Readers who bought one issue featuring alien contact and impossible distances were primed to want that same blend again. Editors, watching sales figures, responded by asking their regular writers for more of what had already proven popular. This is roughly how a single narrative trick tried once became a recognizable feature of an entire literary marketplace rather than a curiosity confined to one imagination. It is worth pausing on how deliberate this machinery was, because it did not run on the strength of any one inspired story. Pulp publishing depended on volume. A magazine needed enough material every month to fill dozens of pages, and that appetite pushed editors toward cultivating recurring writers who could deliver reliably on theme and tone. A writer who had already shown a knack for imagining star-spanning journeys, whatever mechanism explained them, became a valuable and repeatable asset. Over time, certain names became associated with certain kinds of adventure, and a reader picking up an issue could reasonably guess from the author's name alone roughly what sort of impossible distance they were about to cross. That predictability was not a failure of imagination. It was the beginning of a genre building its own internal logic, issue by issue, inside a public marketplace that rewarded familiarity nearly as much as invention. None of this could have worked without a visual hook to catch a browsing eye in the first place, and this is where the cover became inseparable from the story it introduced. Striking, often vivid cover art was a central marketing device for these magazines, deployed to pull a reader's attention away from the dozens of competing titles crowded onto the same newsstand rack. A painted starship, a looming alien silhouette, a hero flung across some impossible gulf of space, all of it existed to answer a practical question: why spend limited coins on this issue rather than the one beside it? The cover was the first and sometimes the only argument a magazine could make before it was bought, and that argument had to land in a glance rather than a paragraph. What makes this detail more than a footnote about marketing is the feedback loop it created between image and story. It was common enough in pulp publishing for an artist to paint a striking cover first, built around some vivid but still unwritten scene, and for an editor to commission a story afterward to match it. That means the visual promise of a shortcut through space, an image of a hull crossing some starlit gulf, could sometimes exist before any narrative logic had justified it. The picture came first, and the explanation followed, catching up to whatever the artwork had already promised. This reversed the usual order of invention. Rather than an author dreaming up a mechanism and then describing it, the mechanism sometimes had to be built backward to fit an image that had already done its job of selling the issue. This close, almost circular relationship between art and text reinforced the same lesson installment publishing was already teaching, that certain images and premises sold, and that selling was the truest test of what belonged in the genre. A striking cover showing some impossible leap across the void did not merely decorate a story, it certified, before a single page was read, that leaping across the void was a normal and expected thing for this kind of magazine to contain. Readers absorbed that lesson issue after issue, cover after cover, until impossible travel stopped feeling like a novelty dreamed up by one writer and started feeling like a basic, assumed feature of an imaginative landscape they had learned to recognize on sight. By the time a reader had spent a few years following these magazines, moving from issue to issue, recognizing recurring authors and house styles, and responding almost automatically to cover art that promised a familiar thrill, they were no longer simply consuming isolated stories. They were taking part, without much fanfare, in building a shared vocabulary. Editors bought what sold. Artists painted what caught the eye, writers supplied stories to match both demands, and readers, through nothing more dramatic than their own purchasing habits, decided which combinations of those elements would be reinforced and repeated. Faster than light travel, or whatever cruder mechanism stood in for it at the time, was becoming durable not because any single author had gotten it exactly right, but because a whole marketplace of writers, artists, and readers kept recognizing it, rewarding it, and asking for more of the same. That reward system explains why the shortcut through space did not fade the way so many one-off pulp inventions did. It survived because it proved useful to everyone in the business of the magazine, useful to editors filling pages, useful to artists filling covers, and useful to readers who wanted their money's worth of wonder delivered on a predictable schedule. The stage was set, then, for those covers themselves to take on an even larger role, not merely reflecting what the genre already expected, but actively shaping what a reader believed might be waiting on the far side of the page. That home, that role, waiting on the far side of the page, turned out to belong less to sentences than to paint. Before a single story could explain how a ship might cross the gulf between stars, the cover of the magazine had already made a promise about it, and readers learned to trust that promise before they had read a word of the text inside. Picture the newsstand rack itself, crowded with competing titles, each one shouting for a coin and a moment's attention. A reader scanning that rack was not weighing prose style or scientific plausibility. They were reacting to color and shape, to a ship diving past a ringed planet, to a horizon bent the wrong way, to a glow suggesting speeds no train or ship had ever managed. In that instant, before any plot had been read, the cover had already done its work of persuasion. It said, in effect, that the far side of the page held something worth the price of admission and worth carrying home. Much of that persuasive work, especially in the crucial early years of dedicated science fiction publishing, is associated with a single illustrator whose name recurs again and again in accounts of the era, Frank R. Paul. Paul is widely credited as a foundational figure in science fiction art and as a major contributor to the success of Amazing Stories, the first magazine devoted entirely to the genre. His covers did not simply decorate the magazine, they gave it a face, and in doing so, gave the entire emerging genre a visual identity that readers could recognize issue after issue, even when the authors and story titles changed completely. What Paul painted across those years became a kind of shared dictionary before the genre had fully agreed on its own vocabulary in prose. Sleek rockets nosing down onto alien soil, ray weapons throwing sourceless light across a scene, robots built like industrial cathedrals, extraterrestrial landscapes rendered with a confidence that outran what any story could yet justify. Some later commentators go further, suggesting that Paul did not merely illustrate these ideas, but effectively standardized them, fixing the look of rockets, ray guns, and alien vistas so firmly that later artists worked within a visual grammar he had helped establish. That claim is worth holding a little loosely, since crediting any single artist with inventing an entire visual language risks overstating one person's role in a collaborative, competitive marketplace. but the pattern of attribution is consistent enough across enough retrospectives to treat Paul as at minimum a central architect of that shared imagery, even if he was not its sole author. Consider, for instance, the claim that Paul painted an early color image of a space station for a Science Wonder Stories cover in the late 1920s. If that attribution holds, it means readers were already looking at visions of permanent structures floating beyond any planet's surface before most stories had worked out what daily life aboard such a station might involve, let alone before any narrative had settled on how ships might travel swiftly between such outposts and the worlds they served. The image outran the explanation. That is worth sitting with for a moment because it reverses the order we might expect. Ordinarily, we imagine an idea being described first, then illustrated. Here, the illustration seems to have arrived first, or at least alongside, doing imaginative work that the surrounding fiction had not yet caught up to. A similar pattern appears in an account crediting Paul with an early depiction of what would later be called a flying saucer, painted for a cover in the same general period. Whether or not that image genuinely originated the later, much more famous saucer imagery of mid-century culture is difficult to verify with confidence, and the connection should be treated as plausible rather than proven. What can be said more safely is that pulp covers were, at minimum, an active laboratory for shapes and forms that had not yet been fully rationalized by any story, shapes that sometimes outlived the specific tales they were meant to advertise. There is also a personal recollection, attributed to the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, remembering a particular Amazing Stories cover from the late 1920s depicting Jupiter, painted by Paul. The recollection suggests that seeing that image gave a young reader a felt sense of the planet's scale and strangeness, as though he were already looking at it from some vantage point far closer than any telescope could offer. This kind of testimony is valuable, but should be treated as a single remembered impression rather than proof of any wider effect. Still, it illustrates something worth taking seriously. A well-made cover could compress an abstract fact, a planet's enormous size, its swirling storms, its remoteness, into a single emotional impression that a reader might carry for years afterward. Something worth taking seriously. A well-made cover could compress an abstract fact. It is worth pausing on how these images were actually produced, because it clarifies what job the cover was really doing. According to some retrospectives, Paul frequently worked from editorial summaries of a story rather than from the complete manuscript itself. If that practice was common, it means the cover artist's task was never simply to transcribe the story faithfully. The cover had its own separate assignment, to promise a world, a mood, a sense of scale and danger, independent of whatever precise mechanism the author eventually settled on to explain the journey. The picture did not need to know how the ship crossed the distance between stars. It only needed to make the reader believe, at a glance, that such a crossing was thrilling and somehow within reach. This is the quiet contract that cover art built between magazine and reader, issue after issue. The picture offered awe first, and the story was left to backfill plausibility afterward, sometimes successfully, sometimes not at all. Over time, readers absorbed a visual expectation, ships that moved impossibly fast, worlds glimpsed as if from a porthole, stations and horizons that implied travel routes no physics of the period could yet support. That expectation did not answer the central question, of course. It did not explain how anyone might exceed the speed of light, but it did something arguably just as important for a young genre trying to find its footing. It made the destination feel real enough and desirable enough that the missing explanation felt like a debt still owed rather than a reason to stop dreaming. And it was precisely that owed debt, that gap between a painted promise and an unproven mechanism, which the next generation of writers would feel obligated to repay, as science fiction entered a period determined to dress its wonders in the language of engineering. That debt, owed by every painted promise of a starlit destination, came due in a period the genre would later remember as its golden age. The years running from the late 1930s through the 1940s are usually described this way in retrospect, and a great deal of that description centers on a single editor working out of the offices of a magazine called Astounding. His name was John W. Campbell, and though he is remembered mostly for the writers he shaped and the standards he demanded of them, his own path into that role began earlier, as a writer himself, wrestling with the very problem his future authors would inherit. In the spring of 1931, in the pages of Amazing Stories Quarterly, Campbell published a novel called Islands of Space. It is a minor work by most literary measures, but it holds an outsized place in the story of this chapter because it is widely credited as an early source for two terms that would eventually become genre furniture: hyperspace and the warp drive. That attribution comes with some caution, since the exact path by which a term spreads through a body of literature is rarely as clean as a single book and a single date. Later writers may have arrived at similar language independently or absorbed it second-hand through channels no bibliography fully tracks. Still, the credit persists for a reason. Something in that novel's vocabulary gave later writers a shorthand they badly needed, a way of naming the unnamed gap between ordinary space and wherever a ship needed to go for the plot to keep moving. That need was never abstract. By the time Campbell moved from writing stories to editing them, the genre had already trained its readers, through a decade of painted covers and pulp serials, to expect journeys between stars as a normal feature of the imagined future. What the fiction had not yet supplied, in any consistent way, was a believable reason those journeys could happen quickly enough to matter. A story about diplomats meeting between solar systems, or traders running routes among a dozen suns, or a fleet arriving before a crisis resolves itself, cannot function if the travel alone takes centuries. The old habit of glossing over the mechanism, inherited from magic carpets and lost valleys and ether vortices, still worked well enough for a single voyage told in isolation. It worked far less well once writers wanted something larger, an ongoing civilization spread across many worlds, with commerce and war and correspondence all moving on a schedule a reader could follow from one installment to the next. Campbell, once he became an editor rather than merely a contributor, pushed his authors toward exactly that kind of larger canvas. He wanted stories that felt like engineering rather than fantasy, in which impossible things were handled with the seriousness of an actual technical problem, even when no real solution existed anywhere behind the page. This is part of why his editorial period, later given its own dedicated attention in historical surveys of the genre, is treated as a turning point. Faster-than-light travel did not become scientifically solved during these years. It did not need to. What changed was that the genre's writers, prodded by an editor who demanded a certain tone of plausibility, began treating the shortcut itself as something worth naming, defining, and using consistently, rather than waving it away in a single vague sentence before returning to the adventure at hand. Out of that pressure came a small vocabulary that would outlast any individual story. Hyperspace, imagined as some other layer or dimension of reality where the ordinary rules of distance did not fully apply, offered one solution. A ship might duck out of normal space, travel through this stranger medium, and reappear somewhere far off without technically breaking the speed limit that ordinary space enforced. It was, in a sense, the old ether tube story from the turn of the century, dressed now in more technical language and expected to hold up under a slightly harder kind of scrutiny. Warp drive offered a related idea, imagining some way of bending or distorting space itself so that great distances effectively shrank, letting a ship arrive quickly without ever quite exceeding the old cosmic limit in the strictest local sense. Neither idea would ever be built. Both, however, gave writers something concrete enough to describe, argue over, and reuse from story to story, which mattered more for the genre's development than whether either idea could survive a physicist's patient objections. It is worth being honest about how uneven this process actually was. Different writers, working for different editors and sometimes for the very same one, used different words for essentially the same narrative function, and a reader moving from one magazine to another might find no consistent terminology at all. Some ships simply went fast without explanation. Others relied on devices given entirely different names that never caught on the way hyperspace and warp eventually would. The claim here is not that the terminology arrived neatly or all at once, but that the function these words served, however they happened to be labeled, became something readers increasingly expected as basic equipment for any story that wanted to move its characters across true interstellar distances rather than staying confined to a single solar system. That expectation changed what kinds of stories could be told at all. Once writers and readers alike accepted that some kind of shortcut, named or unnamed, would move ships between stars in a reasonable narrative span, the door opened to entire imagined civilizations stretched across many worlds. Trade could flow between systems the way it once flowed between distant ports. Governments could claim territory across light years the way older adventure fiction once claimed unexplored continents. Diplomatic missions could travel far enough to negotiate before a crisis resolved itself, rather than arriving generations too late to matter. None of this required the underlying physics to exist. It only required an audience willing to accept the shortcut as stable background machinery, the same way a reader accepts that a telephone call connects almost instantly without needing the wiring explained every single time a character lifts the receiver. This really is the heart of what the Golden Age accomplished on this particular front. It did not resolve the tension between scientific caution and narrative necessity so much as it normalized living comfortably inside that tension. Editors like Campbell wanted the appearance of rigor, the sense that a story's science had been carefully thought through, even when it plainly had not been, and writers learned to supply that appearance through confident vocabulary and consistent internal rules, rather than through any actual solution. A ship that used a named, consistently described method of exceeding light speed felt more credible to a 1940s reader than a ship that simply arrived without comment, even though neither ship's method could survive contact with a laboratory. This illusion of technical seriousness did real narrative work, letting stories feel like engineering documents drawn from a plausible future rather than fairy tales dressed up in metal plating. By the close of this period, hyperspace and warp-style travel had become something close to common property, available to any writer who needed a fleet somewhere quickly, a pair of lovers reunited across an impossible gap, or an empire large enough to require regular inspection. The exact origins of each term remain genuinely debated among historians of the genre, and the diffusion from Campbell's early novel through the wider body of pulp and post-pulp fiction almost certainly ran through more channels than any single surviving record can fully trace. But the outcome is clear enough regardless of the precise path. Faster-than-light travel had stopped being a novelty requiring fresh justification in every new story and had become part of the ordinary furniture of the imagined future, present in the background the way plumbing is present in a room, assumed rather than announced. That normalization, more than any one invented device, is the true accomplishment of these years, and it is what let the genre's writers move confidently from single daring voyages toward entire settled galaxies of trade, treaty, and long-distance argument. Yet furniture still needs some account of how it was built, and the readers of this era were not entirely content to let the shortcut rest on pure faith alone. Alongside the swelling confidence of Golden Age adventure ran a quieter, more anxious project, an attempt, however improvised, to give these impossible journeys a plausible shape, borrowing scraps of real physics, honest guesswork, and outright invention in roughly equal measure, which is where the story turns next. That improvised project, borrowing scraps of real physics, honest guesswork, and outright invention in roughly equal measure, deserves a closer look before the story moves on, because it tells us something about the people doing the borrowing. They were not con artists dressing up nonsense to fool a gullible public. Most of them were curious, reasonably well-read amateurs and professionals alike, doing their best to keep pace with a science that was itself changing faster than most working writers could track. The gap between what physics actually claimed and what a story needed was real, and the people writing into that gap were, for the most part, working in good faith, reaching for whatever tools the culture around them made available. Consider the ordinary technical problems that were already occupying serious minds in the decades before and after the turn of the century. Railroads needed synchronized clocks to avoid collisions. Governments and military planners needed reliable time signals across long distances to coordinate anything at all, from troop movements to shipping schedules. This was not an abstract puzzle confined to university lecture halls. It was a daily operational headache for anyone running a network on a timetable. When Einstein's reasoning about relativity emerged in the early 1900s, it grew directly out of these concerns about clocks, simultaneity, and how two observers might disagree about when something happened. That grounding in practical modern life is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why relativity did not stay locked inside physics journals. It felt to an attentive reader outside the field like something connected to trains and telegraphs and the ordinary machinery of a synchronized world, not like a foreign language spoken only by specialists. That sense of connection mattered enormously to writers looking for a way to make impossible travel sound formally serious. If time itself could stretch and bend under the right conditions, and if the person who said so had built that claim out of clocks and coordination rather than mysticism, then surely there was room, somewhere in that framework, for a story to slip through. The logic was not always sound, and it was frequently stretched well past what the physics actually permitted, but the impulse behind it was recognizable and even sympathetic. Take something real, something already carrying the authority of established science, and lean on it just hard enough to support a plot without quite breaking it. Ether theory had offered an earlier version of the same comfort, as the previous chapter's vortices and tubes made clear, and for a while it worked reasonably well as a shared vocabulary between writer and reader. But ether was already fading from serious scientific standing well before the pulp era hit its stride, and writers who kept using it were increasingly borrowing from a theory the physicists themselves were quietly abandoning. This created an odd situation in which the fiction sometimes lagged behind the science by a decade or two, still building star roads out of a medium that laboratories had stopped taking seriously. It was not exactly dishonest, it was closer to a shared folk memory of a discarded idea, kept alive because it remained useful and because most readers had no easy way to check. Higher dimensions offered a different kind of shortcut, one with less scientific baggage to shed and more openly speculative appeal. If ordinary three-dimensional space was too vast to cross in a human lifetime, perhaps a ship could step sideways into a fourth spatial dimension and emerge somewhere closer to its destination, folding the intervening distance the way a piece of paper folds to bring two distant points together. This idea did not require abandoning known physics so much as gesturing toward its unexplored edges, where genuine mathematicians were in fact doing serious work on dimensional geometry, even if that work had nothing to do with spaceships. Writers picked up the vocabulary of higher dimensions the way earlier writers had picked up ether, as a respectable-sounding place to hide the machinery that made the plot move forward. Time dilation, once relativity had entered public awareness, became perhaps the most persistently misapplied borrowing of all. The genuine physics said something narrow and strange, that time passes differently for observers moving at very different speeds relative to each other, an effect that becomes significant only near the speed of light, and that comes bundled with serious complications for anyone hoping to use it as a travel shortcut. Popular retellings, including plenty in speculative fiction, often smoothed over those complications, treating time dilation as though it were a loophole in the universe's speed limit rather than a strict consequence of it. This was less deliberate distortion than plain misunderstanding, spread by writers who had encountered the concept secondhand, through popular summaries rather than the underlying mathematics, and who reasonably assumed that anything this strange might have stranger cousins still hidden in a mostly unread technical literature. It would be convenient at this point to say that some particular writer or magazine editor invented a specific trope out of a specific theory, and that the trope then spread outward from that single moment of insight. Stories along those lines do circulate in fan histories and reminiscences, and they are appealing precisely because they turn a messy collective process into a tidy origin tale. But those stories deserve real skepticism. The available record does not clearly support attaching any famous shortcut to one identifiable act of borrowing from one identifiable source, and where such claims exist, they tend to have been simplified well after the fact, smoothed into a better story than the historical record can actually confirm. What seems more accurate, if less satisfying, is a picture of many writers and editors independently reaching for similar tools because those tools were culturally available and vaguely legitimate sounding at roughly the same time. It is worth remembering, too, that speculative and outright fringe physics did not disappear once respectable science moved on. Collections of unconventional physical theories, gathered and preserved well into the later 20th century, show that a whole ecosystem of alternative and marginal ideas persisted for decades, existing alongside mainstream physics rather than being cleanly replaced by it. Writers hunting for plausible-sounding shortcuts had, at almost any point in the century, a genuine menu of half-credible options to choose from, some barely distinguishable from crankery and others sitting closer to the field's actual edges. The line between honest speculation and fringe belief was rarely obvious from inside the moment, and that blurriness gave fiction plenty of raw material to work with. None of this required cynicism on the part of the writers involved. A story does not need its author to believe every word of its internal explanation in order to function, and many working writers understood their pseudo-physics as scaffolding rather than doctrine, a way of granting the reader permission to stop asking questions and start caring about the characters instead. The goal was never to publish a correct theory. The goal was to let a reader accept, at least for the length of a story, that the ship crossing an impossible gulf was doing something explicable rather than magical, a distinction that mattered enormously to an audience that prided itself on liking its wonders dressed in the language of engineering. That straight-faced plausibility, patched together as it was from borrowed and half-understood science, turned out to be exactly what the genre's growing readership wanted, and it gave them something worth arguing about the moment the magazines landed in their hands, when the letter columns filled with opinions, corrections, and the occasional late-night quarrel over whether any of it could possibly be true. That late-night quarrel over plausibility did not stay contained to a single mind puzzling over a magazine in a lamp-lit room. It spread, because the magazines themselves had quietly built the plumbing for it to spread. Tucked at the back of nearly every issue sat a section of printed letters, arguments and praise and correction from readers who had bothered to write in, and next to each letter, as a matter of ordinary editorial habit, ran that reader's full mailing address. This was not done with any grand plan in mind. It was simply how magazines of the period handled correspondence, a bookkeeping convenience more than a philosophy, but the effect turned out to be enormous. A reader who disagreed with someone else's opinion about a story's science no longer had to hope the editor would print a rebuttal months later. He could write directly to the person who had said it, address in hand, and start an argument that belonged entirely to the two of them, unmediated by anyone else. That small mechanical fact, an address sitting beside an opinion, deserves more credit than it usually gets for turning science fiction from something people read alone into something people read together, even when they never met face to face. A dispute about whether a certain author's faster-than-light gadget made any sense could begin in the letter column, migrate into private correspondence between two strangers who lived states apart, and continue for months without either the editor or the rest of that issue's stories ever entering into it again. The magazine had provided the meeting place, but the conversation, once lit, could travel on its own fuel, independent of the very pages that had first struck the match. Fandom, as later fans and historians would come to call this whole loose network, grew outward from exactly that seed. The pattern tended to move in a fairly consistent direction, even if no two readers arrived at it by quite the same path. Correspondence led to local gatherings, gatherings led to clubs, and clubs led, eventually, to something more organized and more permanent on paper. A handful of readers in a given city, having traded enough letters, might simply decide to meet, and once they met regularly enough to give the arrangement a name, a club existed in every sense that mattered. From there, some of those same readers began producing their own amateur publications, cheaply printed and eagerly circulated, carrying essays, reviews, and endless opinions about which stories deserved to be taken seriously and which ones had cheated their readers of a fair explanation. Two kinds of publishing effort mattered most in this homemade landscape, and it is worth being plain about how they differed from one another. Amateur press associations worked by bundling. Each participating fan produced a set number of copies of their own pages, mailed them to a central coordinator, and received back a thick packet containing everyone else's contributions all at once, ready to be read and answered in the next round of mailings. Genzines worked more like small independent magazines, gathered under a single editorial hand rather than assembled from many separate contributions, but serving much the same social purpose of keeping a running conversation alive from issue to issue. Some fanzines moved between these two forms rather than staying fixed in either, circulating inside an amateur press bundle for a time and then finding readers outside it entirely, which suggests that fandom's various print channels were less like separate rooms and more like doors left open between them. Clubs and conventions supplied the one piece that paper alone could never quite deliver: a face, a voice, an argument that could be finished in a single evening instead of dragged out across an entire season of the mail. A convention gathered fans who might otherwise know each other only through initials at the bottom of a letter, and it let disagreements that had been simmering in print finally happen in person, over the noise of a crowded room, with an immediacy no printed page could supply. None of this replaced the letters and the fanzines that had come before it. It simply added another layer, another kind of room, to a conversation that by then had already been running long enough to need several. It is worth imagining, cautiously and without pretending to document any particular exchange, what a debate like this might have felt like from the inside. A fan finishes a serial installment late one evening, marks a paragraph describing some starship's leap between suns, and finds the explanation either thrilling or worse, a little too convenient. He writes to the magazine, or perhaps directly to a correspondent he has argued with before, laying out exactly why this version of the shortcut felt like cheating, why last month's story had earned its wonder through some scrap of borrowed physics, while this one had simply waved a hand at the problem. That letter might travel for weeks before an answer came back. It might return with a rebuttal, and the rebuttal might spark a third letter, and by then the argument has outlived the very story that started it, taking on a life of its own, independent of the pages that first provoked it. This is the process by which fandom did something no single story could ever manage alone. It stabilized meaning. A lone reader might admire or dismiss a given faster-than-light device in isolation, but that private reaction carried no weight beyond the reader's own head, no matter how strongly felt. Once that reaction became a letter, and the letter became an exchange, and the exchange became the subject of a club meeting or a paragraph in a fanzine passed to dozens of other readers, the judgment stopped being personal and started being communal. Writers and editors who read these letter columns and fanzines just as attentively as any ordinary fan did, absorbed the pattern of what pleased a crowd and what a crowd found cheap or unearned. A device that survived enough rounds of argument without collapsing into ridicule gained a kind of durability that no single glowing review, however enthusiastic, could ever have granted it on its own. It would be a stretch, given what the record actually shows, to claim that any particular hyperspace device or warp mechanism was singled out by name in one specific documented feud, and this chapter should not pretend otherwise. What the evidence supports more confidently is the shape of the process itself. A shortcut proposed in a story got tested, not by physicists in laboratories, but by an attentive and argumentative readership willing to write, mail, print, and gather in order to say so out loud. Some shortcuts survived that testing because they felt elegant, offering just enough mechanism to satisfy without drowning the adventure in explanation nobody wanted to sit through. Others were quietly abandoned or mocked in the letter columns until writers learned to reach for something else instead of trying to defend the indefensible. The travel devices that lasted into later decades were, in a real sense, the ones that had already won an argument nobody outside fandom ever saw fully take place. None of this required any central authority to bless it. There was no single arbiter deciding which faster-than-light concept counted as respectable and which did not. Instead, there was a scattered, overlapping, occasionally contentious network of readers checking each other's enthusiasm against each other's skepticism, mailing address by mailing address, bundle by bundle, convention by convention, until a rough consensus emerged about what kind of impossible shortcut a well-told story was allowed to use without losing its audience's trust. That consensus never stayed fixed forever, but it held long enough to shape what writers offered next, and it is that patient communal negotiation, more than any single author's private invention, which explains why the genre's shortcuts began to feel less like isolated daydreams and more like shared property held in common. It was exactly that shared property, tested and approved by a readership working in loose concert across letters and bundles and crowded rooms, that writers would soon feel free to build entire star-spanning civilizations upon. That shared property, tested and approved by a readership working in loose concert across letters and bundles and crowded rooms, gave writers something sturdier than a single clever idea. It gave them permission. Once enough readers had agreed, in their scattered and informal way, that a ship could plausibly outrun light or slip around it, the shortcut stopped being a one-time trick an author pulled out to rescue a stranded hero. It became a piece of standing infrastructure, something an entire universe could be built on top of, the way a city is built on top of its water mains and its roads, mostly unseen but load-bearing all the same. This shift shows up clearly in the difference between an adventure that happens once and a setting that has to keep happening. Doc Smith's early work, including Triplanetary, which reached readers in book form by the late 1940s after its serialized pulp life, already leaned toward the second kind of story. Smith was not content with a single daring flight between 2 points. His fiction kept widening its frame, pulling in more worlds, more fleets, more political stakes, until the interplanetary voyage of earlier decades started to look almost modest by comparison. The pulp lineage that Smith worked within had spent years normalizing the idea that a story might span not one world but dozens, and that normalization mattered because a writer cannot ask a reader to imagine a galactic war without first convincing them that travel between the warring parties is something closer to routine than miracle. Routine is the key word, and it points to the actual engineering problem underneath the storytelling one. A single dazzling voyage asks very little of a universe. It needs one ship, one crew, one impossible leap, and the story can end the moment the leap succeeds. A galactic empire asks for something else entirely. It needs regular contact between capital and colony. It needs armies that can be moved before a crisis resolves itself without them. It needs merchants who can carry goods across distances that would otherwise swallow a human lifetime in transit alone. None of that works on a single miracle. It works only if the miracle can be repeated, scheduled, and to some extent trusted, the way a train timetable is trusted even by passengers who could not explain how the engine functions. Isaac Asimov's foundation stories illustrate this turn about as plainly as the genre offers. They began, as many of the era's biggest ideas did, in the more modest form of short pieces written for magazine publication across much of the 1940s, before being gathered into the three books now generally called Foundation, Foundation and Empire, and Second Foundation, all published in the early 1950s. What began as installments meant to satisfy a magazine's monthly appetite slowly revealed itself, once assembled, as something closer to a connected history. The individual episodes still worked as episodes, each with its own crisis and its own resolution, but stacked together they described a single unbroken current running underneath, a current made of empire, decline, and the long project of guiding a civilization through centuries it would not live to see completed. That underlying structure is worth sitting with for a moment, because it depends on scale in a way earlier adventure fiction rarely had to. The Foundation narrative is built around a galactic empire whose authority stretches across enormous distances, around a 1,000-year plan meant to shorten a coming dark age, and around the long interregnum between an old order's collapse and whatever order eventually replaces it. None of that framework can function if travel between star systems behaves like travel across an ocean, slow, uncertain, and subject to the whims of weather and distance. An empire that takes decades to send a message from its throne world to its frontier is not really an empire in the political sense. It is a loose association of strangers who happen to share a flag. For Asimov's stellar kingdoms to rise, clash, and eventually reorganize themselves in the wake of the old empire's fall, something in that universe has to move fast enough and reliably enough that distant worlds can still argue with each other, trade with each other, and occasionally go to war with each other on a human rather than geological timescale. The scale itself is worth noting plainly. The trilogy, as later readers have described it, covers something like the first 3.5 centuries of a full millennium of interregnum, a span so long that no single character survives to see its resolution. Telling a story of that size forces an author's hand. If the Empire's territory spans a galaxy and its history spans 1,000 years, then whatever connects one end of that territory to the other has to be assumed as a working, mostly invisible system, present in every chapter whether or not it is ever explained. It becomes background machinery, the same way a modern reader assumes electricity and postal service without needing either explained on every page. This is the moment where faster-than-light travel stops being a plot device in the narrow sense of a tool used to solve one scene's problem and starts becoming something closer to social architecture, a structural assumption that lets politics, trade, and cultural exchange exist as connected systems rather than isolated episodes scattered across unreachable distances. None of the evidence suggests that any single author sat down and declared in so many words that the shortcut had just been promoted from convenience to civilization's foundation. That conclusion is a synthesis, built from watching what these galaxy-spanning stories actually required in order to function at all. But the pattern holds up under its own weight. A story about one voyage needs one bridge across the gap. A story about 1,000 worlds needs a roadmap, and once writers wanted whole populated galaxies instead of single strange planets, faster-than-light travel became exactly that. The map's ink, the thing that let borders, trade routes, and armies exist on the same page without collapsing under the plain physical fact of distance. This is also, notably, where the genre's action-adventure roots and its more ambitious political imagination start to overlap rather than compete. The kind of storytelling later summarized simply as galactic-scale action-adventure, spanning entire star systems and populated worlds, depends on the same underlying assumption that the more careful political fiction depends on. Whether the story is a swashbuckling chase between fleets or a slow meditation on empires rising and falling, both need worlds that can talk to each other faster than starlight technically allows. The genre had, by this point, quietly agreed to grant itself that one exception, and everything else could be built on top of it, adventure and statecraft alike leaning on the same borrowed impossibility. It is worth pausing on what got left out of that bargain, because convenience rarely arrives without a cost tucked behind it. A civilization that can move fleets and traders across a galaxy in weeks or months still has to feed those fleets, staff those trade routes, and manage the ordinary friction of governing distant populations who may never see their rulers in person. Many of these stories, eager for the wonder of connection, moved quickly past the logistics such connection would actually demand, letting the shortcut solve the travel problem while leaving the deeper questions of supply, administration, and loyalty comfortably unexamined. That elision was not a failure exactly. It was a choice made so the story could get on with the business of empire and adventure rather than freight schedules and grain shipments. But it left a seam in the fabric, one that later writers, working in more skeptical decades, would eventually feel obligated to pull at and examine more closely. There is also something almost architectural in how these stories treated their star maps, sketching trade lanes and border worlds with the same casual confidence a mapmaker might apply to rivers and roads on a familiar continent, even though nothing in known physics guaranteed such lanes could exist at all. Readers accepted the sketch because the story needed it, and because years of pulp adventure had already trained them to expect exactly this kind of confident, unexplained connective tissue linking one world to the next. For now, though, the shortcut had done its most important job. It had turned a single planet's worth of adventure into a galaxy's worth of civilization, and it had done so without most readers ever noticing the machinery humming beneath the plot. That same confidence, that same willingness to assume distant worlds could still speak to one another without delay, was about to be tested against a very different kind of urgency, the kind that came not from fictional empires but from a real-world learning in the middle of a global war just how much speed and distance actually mattered. That same confidence, the assumption that distant worlds could speak to one another without delay, was about to meet a very different kind of test. It would not come from another writer's clever fix, or another editor's house style, or another argument settled in a fan letter. It would come from a real global war that was, in its own grinding way, teaching millions of ordinary people what speed and distance actually meant and how much could hinge on shortening the gap between them. Consider what the war did to information itself. For centuries, a message had traveled only as fast as a horse, a ship, or a human runner could carry it, and command decisions had lagged behind events by hours or even days almost as a matter of course. World War II broke that old pattern in ways felt far beyond any single battlefield. British intelligence, working against German military communications, learned to intercept two major kinds of encrypted traffic: Morse-coded Enigma messages and, from 1941 onward, teleprinter transmissions sent under the Tunny cipher, part of what came to be called the fish traffic. Reading an enemy's mail was hardly new. Reading it quickly enough for the contents to still matter, before the moment they described had already passed, was the genuine innovation, and it demanded machinery built specifically for speed. That machinery arrived in the form of Colossus, an electronic device built to handle a key stage of the Tunny decoding process far faster than any human clerk or earlier mechanical system could manage. It is worth sitting with what this meant in practical terms. Code breaking had become, in effect, a race against the clock, in which the value of intercepted information decayed with every hour it sat unread. A message about troop movements was worth a great deal on the morning it was sent, and worth very little a week later. Speed was not a luxury bolted onto intelligence work, it was the entire point of the work, and Colossus existed because someone had recognized that plainly and built for it. The same lesson appeared again, on a far larger scale, during the build-up to the Normandy invasion. Allied forces used decoded German transmissions gathered through the Ultra program to build a clearer picture of how German units might respond to an amphibious assault, including where counterattacks were likely to be sent. That is a striking claim on its own terms. An advantage in the middle of the war's largest invasion came not from more tanks or more soldiers on a given stretch of beach, but from knowing ahead of time, through captured signals, what the other side intended to do. Command advantage, in other words, could be built from information moving quickly rather than from bodies moving quickly. The two had always been related, but the war made that relationship explicit and decisive in a way peacetime logistics rarely had. Koon, the same Normandy build-up, revealed a companion lesson, one that matters just as much to this story. Alongside the real intercepted signals, Allied planners built an elaborate deception using fabricated radio transmissions designed to suggest an entire phantom army poised to strike somewhere it never intended to land. This detail complicates any simple tale about speed as pure virtue. Wartime communication was not only getting faster, it was becoming something that could be manufactured, staged, and aimed at an enemy's expectations, rather than simply reporting the truth to one's own side. Fast information and false information had become two edges of the same expanding capability, both resting on the same underlying base of rapid transmission and rapid interpretation. Radar belongs in this picture too, though its story is less about secrecy and more about reach. Over the course of the war, radar systems developed to exploit higher microwave frequencies, extending how far and how precisely a defending force could detect approaching aircraft or ships. What radar offered was not literal speed of travel, but something adjacent to it, an enlarged field of awareness, a way of knowing what was coming before it arrived close enough to be seen with the naked eye. In a sense, radar compressed distance by converting it into advance warning. It did not make an enemy aircraft arrive any later. It made the defender's knowledge of that aircraft arrive earlier, which in practical terms amounted to much the same gain in usable time. None of this stayed confined to military archives once the fighting ended. The public came away from the period with a new intuitive sense that machines could shrink the world, and that this shrinking mattered to daily life, not only to generals and code breakers tucked away in secret rooms. Aircraft such as the Bell X-1, later preserved and displayed for public viewing, turned raw velocity into something ordinary people could read about and marvel at directly, an achievement of speed made visible rather than classified. It stood alongside radar towers and decoding rooms as proof that the century's machines were rewriting old assumptions about how far apart two places could be considered, once the right technology stood between them. Now, it is worth pausing on how this connects, and how it does not, to the science fiction being written and read across these same years. There is no documented case tying a specific radar breakthrough or code-breaking success directly to any particular story's invented method of faster-than-light travel. Arthur C. Clarke, a writer whose career spanned scientific speculation and imaginative travel fiction across this era, is worth naming here, though the available record does not establish a precise line from any wartime system to any specific tale he or his contemporaries produced. This caution matters. It would be tidy and too easy to claim that a particular radar set inspired a particular hyperdrive, and no honest account of this history should pretend that link has been shown when it has not. What can be said more broadly and more carefully is that the surrounding cultural atmosphere had shifted. Readers who opened a magazine in the years following the war were not quite the same readers who had opened one before it. They had lived through or grown up hearing about a period in which encrypted messages moved at the speed of electricity, in which false signals could summon an imaginary army out of thin air, in which radar let a nation glimpse danger before it was visible, and in which raw speed itself had become a matter of public record and public pride. Against that backdrop, a story describing instant communication across a galactic empire or a ship leaping between star systems in defiance of ordinary distance no longer felt like pure fantasy borrowed from nowhere. It felt like an extension of lessons the century had already delivered through very real, very audible machines. This is the pressure worth naming plainly, without overstating its precision. Not a single traceable chain running from one invention to one story, but a broad and reasonable resonance between a world that had just learned distance could be rewritten by technology, and a genre whose central promise had always been that distance, however vast, was never quite the final word. Fiction did not need to copy the war's machinery to feel its pull. It only needed an audience that had learned from lived experience rather than speculation to expect speed to matter and to expect coordination across distance to decide outcomes. That expectation, however patiently it had settled into the ordinary reader's imagination, was about to run into a different kind of pressure entirely. One arriving not from engineers or code breakers, but from writers themselves, who would soon begin asking in print and in argument whether wonder alone was still answer enough. That question, whether wonder alone was still answer enough, did not arrive as a sudden verdict handed down by any single author or editorial meeting. It arrived the way most literary shifts arrive, through accumulation, through a slow change in what writers felt permitted to ask on the page. For roughly 2 decades, the shortcut across the stars had done steady, uncomplicated work. It got the hero from one planet to the next. It let empires trade and quarrel without waiting centuries for a reply. It was infrastructure, not argument, the kind of assumption a story could lean on without ever pausing to defend it. But infrastructure, once it has stood long enough, tends to attract people who want to know what it is built on, and by the 1950s and 60s, a new generation of writers began looking underneath the floorboards of the genre they had inherited. Some of that looking was gentle, almost wistful, rather than confrontational. Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, gathered into a single volume in the middle of the century, did not spend much energy justifying how its characters got to Mars. The traveling was assumed, folded into the premise without comment, so that the book's real attention could fall elsewhere, on nostalgia, on guilt, on the strange sorrow of one culture arriving uninvited into another's home. Bradbury was not interrogating the physics of the journey at all. He was interrogating what the journey did to the people who took it and to the people already living where they landed. That distinction matters because it shows the seed of something that would grow much larger in the following decades. Once a writer starts asking what a shortcut does to a soul or a society, the shortcut stops being purely decorative. It becomes evidence, a detail with consequences attached rather than a convenience quietly forgiven. Through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, that seed became a deliberate movement, one later writers and critics would come to name the New Wave, associated most often with the British editor and novelist Michael Moorcock and the American writer and anthologist Harlan Ellison. The New Wave was less a single doctrine than a shared appetite for rebellion against the conventions the Golden Age had settled into place. Moorcock, from his editorial chair, published essays and polemics pushing writers away from clean engineering optimism and towards stranger, more psychologically restless material. Ellison, through anthologies gathered under titles like Dangerous Visions and, several years later, again Dangerous Visions, collected stories that many mainstream magazines of the previous decades would have hesitated to print, stories about desire, about political failure, about altered perception, about despair that offered no tidy engineering fix. FTL travel did not disappear from these pages, but it stopped being treated as a neutral stage direction. It became one more piece of inherited furniture worth turning over to see what was written on the underside. Part of what changed was simply where writers chose to point their attention. Earlier decades of the genre had tended to treat the interior of a starship or the workings of its engine as the main event, worth a paragraph or two of confident technical color, even when that color was invented from very little. The new wave writers were often far less interested in the machine and far more interested in the passenger. What does it do to a person, psychologically, to step through some kind of drive and arrive somewhere else without the ordinary felt passage of days or weeks? What does it do to memory, to grief, to a sense of continuous identity, if the body arrives intact while something harder to name gets left scattered along the way? These were not questions the pulps of earlier decades had much patience for, not because those writers lacked imagination, but because the genre's earlier bargain with its readers was mostly about forward motion, about reaching the adventure rather than lingering over what the reaching had cost. Colonial anxiety crept into the shortcut as well, and this deserves to be named carefully rather than overstated. Nothing here should be mistaken for a single decisive novel that flipped a switch. It is fairer to describe a gradual, uneven reckoning spreading across many hands and many manuscripts. Still, one can feel it building. Stories in which arriving swiftly at a distant world was no longer an innocent convenience, but an act with a history attached, evoking the older, real-world business of ships arriving somewhere with unequal power carried in their holds, a drive that let an empire's soldiers or traders appear anywhere without the friction of real travel time began to read in more skeptical hands, less like a miracle and more like a weapon dressed up as convenience. The economics of such a system drew fresh scrutiny too. If goods and armies could leap between star systems at will, what happened to distance as a source of independence, of local culture, of political breathing room? Earlier decades had rarely paused on that question. The newer writers frequently could not stop asking it, turning what had once been a simple plot engine into something closer to a moral ledger. Time itself became a related site of unease, and the genre's long-standing fascination with time travel offered a useful neighboring laboratory for these same anxieties. Causality, paradox, and consequence, once treated mostly as a puzzle to be solved cleverly within a single episode, increasingly became the entire point of a story rather than its gimmick. A ship that outran light, after all, was already flirting with time in ways earlier pulp writers had mostly waved past without dwelling on the discomfort. If arriving before a signal could arrive, or returning home to find years had passed unevenly for those left behind, the fiction of effortless connection between worlds started to feel less like triumph and more like dislocation. Writers exploring this terrain were not abandoning the shortcut. They were asking it to carry weight it had never been asked to carry before. Guilt, distance, the fraying of relationships across a gap that no longer measured cleanly in ordinary days or years. This period also produced writers willing to step outside the story entirely and examine the genre's language as an object in its own right. Samuel R. Delany, already known as a novelist working inside these same speculative traditions, published critical writing, including a collection titled The Jewel-Hinged Jaw, that treated science fiction's sentences, its habits of description, its unexamined shortcuts, as material worth close reading rather than simply worth using. This is a small but telling marker. It suggests that by this point, some of the genre's own most capable writers no longer regarded FTL or any of its companion devices as furniture too familiar to notice. They were willing to hold the language up to the light and ask what assumptions were baked into it, the same way a careful reader might ask what a well-worn phrase quietly implies every time someone repeats it without thinking. None of this amounted to abandonment, and it is worth being plain about that, because it would be easy to overstate the rebellion into something closer to rejection. The new wave writers did not stop sending characters faster than light. Many still needed the device exactly as earlier writers had needed it, as a practical means of keeping a plot moving across distances that honest physics would otherwise make unbearable to narrate in full. What changed was the surrounding posture. The device now arrived in the stronger examples of the period, dressed in implication, colonial memory, economic imbalance, psychological cost, the fragile accuracy of any map trying to describe a universe that refused to hold still. Wonder had not been defeated. It had simply been asked to share the page with doubt, and it turned out to have room enough to do so without losing its old appeal. That expanded room is really the heart of what this reinterpretation accomplished. Earlier stages of this same idea's history had been occupied with different tasks: building the imagery, testing the plausibility, negotiating the details among readers, scaling the device up to civilization-sized stakes. The new wave era added something those earlier stages had mostly skipped: a willingness to ask what the shortcut meant rather than only how it worked. And having survived that scrutiny without being discarded, the idea proved sturdier than a simple gadget has any right to be. It had grown able to hold contradiction, able to serve both the reader wanting adventure and the reader wanting unease, sometimes within the very same book, sometimes within the very same paragraph. That flexibility would matter a great deal as the genre's writers turned next to a harder, more mathematical kind of resistance, the one supplied not by literary doubt but by relativity itself, and to the uneasy bargains readers would soon have to strike between the science they respected and the stories they still wanted told. The literary reinterpretation that had taught readers to expect unease alongside adventure was about to meet a far sturdier obstacle, one that cared nothing at all for narrative tone. Relativity had been part of physics for more than a century by the time science fiction's writers began questioning their own sense of wonder, and it had never offered the genre much comfort. Einstein's framework tied space and time into a single structure, and within that structure the universe's speed limit stopped looking like an opinion and started looking like a built-in boundary. Nothing with mass, the physics said plainly, could reach the speed of light, because doing so would require an amount of energy no engine, however imagined, could ever supply. This was not a rule waiting to be outgrown by cleverer engineering. It behaved more like an accounting problem with no workable solution, one that had been sitting there since long before any pulp magazine promised its readers otherwise. That created a strange kind of pressure on the genre, though not the kind that shows up as open conflict between camps. Few writers sat down determined to defy Einstein on purpose, and few readers demanded that they try. What happened instead was subtler. The science kept getting clearer about what could not be done, while the stories kept finding reasons why audiences still wanted to feel it happen anyway. These two tracks ran side by side rather than colliding head-on, and that parallel motion is really the heart of the matter. Physics was not trying to spoil the fun, and fiction was not trying to disprove physics. They were answering different questions, one about what nature permits and one about what a story needs in order to keep its promise that distant places remain reachable. It helped, in a way easy to underestimate, that the universe kept growing larger in the public imagination at almost the same pace that the science was closing the door on shortcuts. Modern astronomy steadily revealed scales that made older adventure story distances look almost quaint by comparison. Galaxies turned out to sit unfathomably far apart, and even neighboring star systems lay at distances light itself needed years to cross. The larger the real universe became, the more absurd it seemed to imagine covering it at ordinary speeds, and the more that absurdity practically invited some kind of narrative workaround, even one everybody understood to be make-believe from the start. Writers and readers found a way to live inside that contradiction, and one of the more elegant compromises borrowed a genuine piece of theoretical physics rather than ignoring the subject altogether. The idea of a wormhole, a shortcut through the geometry of space itself, offered a way to imagine distant places as somehow closer without requiring anything to move faster than light in the ordinary sense. Physics treats such a passage as fundamentally different from literal superluminal travel, a bending of space rather than a race through it, though even this shortcut would still demand exotic mass and energy on a scale that keeps it squarely in the realm of theory rather than engineering. The appeal is easy to see anyway. It let the genre borrow the vocabulary of real cosmology, and that borrowed respectability gave the old shortcut a kind of intellectual cover the pulp era had never quite managed to earn. Hyperspace could now be mentioned in the same breath as legitimate physics, even while everyone understood the practical version remained permanently out of reach. Real astronomy handed storytellers a subtler gift almost by accident. Astronomers studying certain violent, distant phenomena, jets of material blasting outward near black holes, have observed motion that appears from Earth's vantage point to exceed the speed of light. The appearance is a trick of geometry and timing rather than an actual violation of the cosmic speed limit, but the phrase itself, matter that looks like it is outrunning light, reads like something invented for a novel rather than confirmed by observation. It let the genre gesture toward genuine astrophysics while keeping its faster-than-light dreams alive in spirit, borrowing legitimacy from a phenomenon strange enough to sound like fiction while remaining entirely within the bounds of accepted science. None of this stopped writers from building warp drives and hyperspace lanes exactly as before, and that persistence deserves an honest explanation rather than a dismissal as simple denial. Readers were not confused about the difference between physics and story. Most understood perfectly well that no ship was going to outrun light in the world they actually inhabited. What they wanted was something else entirely, the experience of holding an impossibility in mind without being asked to believe it as literal fact, in something like the way a listener enjoys a ghost story without expecting a haunting to follow them home afterward. The tension between what the equations forbade and what the plot required became itself a source of pleasure rather than an obstacle to it. It let the reader feel the true vastness of space, even respect that vastness, while still being carried across it in a way ordinary physics could never grant. Seen this way, the endurance of faster-than-light travel in fiction was not a failure to keep pace with science. It was closer to a working arrangement, unspoken but widely honored on both sides, in which physics kept the record straight about what nature allows, and stories kept a separate, equally sincere promise to make distance survivable within the shape of a plot. Both promises could be true at once, because they were never really competing for the same kind of belief. The reader who accepted relativity in a classroom could still cheer an hour later as a fictional ship crossed a gulf no real ship ever could, and there was no contradiction hiding inside that moment, only two different kinds of trust extended for two different purposes. This is, in the end, why the fantasy persisted even as the physics hardened against it. The harder the constraint became, the more valuable the fictional workaround felt, because a shortcut only feels precious once the difficulty of the real journey is fully understood. Readers did not need to be fooled into thinking hyperspace was real. They needed only to be given permission to enjoy the idea of it, fully aware of its impossibility, the way one enjoys a well-told story about ghosts or luck or fate without mistaking the enjoyment for belief. That permission, granted quietly by decades of magazines, editors, and patient argument among readers, turned out to be sturdier than any single scientific correction could dislodge. That settled arrangement, struck without any formal announcement and rarely spoken aloud in quite these terms, would go on to outlast the specific magazines, movements, and arguments that shaped it, carrying the impossible shortcut forward into decades its earliest writers never lived to see, and setting the stage for how thoroughly that shortcut would embed itself in the culture that followed. That settled arrangement, struck without any formal announcement, carried the impossible shortcut forward into decades its earliest writers never lived to see. And it is worth asking now, at the end of this long walk through magazines and letter columns and cover art, what exactly survived? Not the machinery, certainly. No engineer today reaches for a 1930s diagram of a warp coil or a hyperspace bypass and expects it to function. What survived instead is something harder to hold and easier to overlook, a habit of imagining distance as something that can be crossed, a shared expectation that the stars are, in principle, reachable, and that a story is allowed to get its characters there without apologizing for the trip. The magazines themselves are mostly gone now, at least in their original form. The paper they were printed on was cheap wood pulp, chosen because it kept costs low for editors trying to hold a struggling genre together on newsstand margins, and that same cheapness made the paper fragile almost from the moment it left the press. Pages yellowed within a few years, spines cracked under ordinary handling, a great many issues that once passed from reader to reader, dog-eared and argued over, simply did not survive the plain wear of decades, and for a long stretch the standard solution was to photograph their contents onto microfilm, the archival technology of choice through much of the mid-20th century. Microfilm preserved the words well enough. It could not do what the covers had done. It rendered every illustration in flattened gray, stripping away the color, the brushwork, the exaggerated glow of alien suns and impossible engines that had first pulled readers toward the impossible shortcut in the first place. Institutions charged with keeping this material eventually recognized that the covers were not disposable packaging wrapped around the real content. They were part of the content, part of the argument the magazines had been making from the start, and losing them meant losing roughly half of what the genre had actually communicated to its earliest readers. So the original issues themselves became the archive worth protecting, not just their sentences, but their look, kept now as physical objects in climate-controlled rooms and handled with the same caution given to any fragile historical artifact. Exhibitions built around collections like these have gone so far as to treat science fiction as a distinct visual and literary culture in its own right, worthy of the same careful framing usually reserved for fine art or rare manuscripts. There is something worth sitting with in that decision. A cover painted to sell a magazine for a few cents off a drugstore rack, meant to be glanced at once and then forgotten, ended up treated decades later as evidence of how an entire culture first pictured the shortcut between stars. Reconstructing the exact feeling a reader had holding one of these issues is not something any historian can do with certainty, but it is fair to say that something real survives in those rooms, not merely paper, but the visual grammar that shaped how millions of people first imagined faster-than-light travel long before they ever saw it rendered on a screen. That visual grammar did not stay confined to library shelves and preservation vaults. It migrated the way genre conventions tend to migrate, from one generation of storytellers to the next, carried less through direct citation than through simple inheritance. The magazine ecosystem itself had already demonstrated how this kind of transmission worked, and it worked for a remarkably long stretch of time, shaping how the genre was written and understood for more than 4 decades, from the pulp era launched when amazing stories first appeared on newsstands through the mid-20th century and beyond. Writers who came up through those pages, learning their craft under the letter columns and editorial habits of Amazing Stories and its many competitors, went on to become some of the most influential names science fiction would ever produce. Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, A. E. Van Vogt, Theodore Sturgeon, Ray Bradbury, and Arthur Clarke did not arrive fully formed, working in isolation from everything around them. They were shaped by the same market of impossible distance that had already shaped Edward Elmer Smith and Edmund Hamilton before them, the writers whose sprawling space opera adventures had first stretched the shortcut across whole galaxies. Each new writer carried the assumptions of that earlier corridor forward into new decades and eventually into mediums their pulp predecessors could not have imagined. By the time faster-than-light travel reached film and television, and later console games and sprawling online worlds built by thousands of collaborating strangers, the underlying assumption was already settled, treated by then as something closer to furniture than to open argument. A ship could simply go, and audiences did not need the premise relitigated at the start of every new story, because the premise had already been argued out decades earlier in magazine pages and among readers writing to one another about plausibility late into the night. What changed over the years was mostly presentation. The specific vocabulary shifted from decade to decade and franchise to franchise, but the underlying corridor, the notion that some clever narrative device could compress unbearable distance into a bearable story, stayed remarkably intact underneath all that surface change. It is worth being honest here about the limits of what can be traced with real precision. There is no single document connecting one particular pulp-era gadget to one particular modern franchise term, no clean paper trail proving that a specific magazine story invented a specific later idea outright. What can be said with more confidence is broader and in its own way more interesting. The entire imaginative habit of treating interstellar distance as a solvable narrative problem rather than an insurmountable one took shape first in these magazines, was tested and refined by their readers, and was then handed down through the very writers those magazines had trained. That inheritance shows up in unexpected corners of the archive as well. Among the historical materials that libraries and collectors have preserved alongside the magazines themselves are items charting with genuine seriousness, something like the evolution of interstellar spaceflight as a subject in its own right, treating it not merely as entertainment but as a topic with a real intellectual history worth documenting on its own terms. That such material exists and continues to be cared for by people whose job is preserving the historical record suggests that faster-than-light travel outgrew its origins as pulp adventure fodder somewhere along the way and became something people were willing to study historically, the way one might study the history of an actual working technology, even though no working version of it has ever left the page. In some sense, the idea earned that treatment honestly. It shaped how multiple generations of readers thought about scale, distance, and possibility, whether or not any of it was ever physically achievable in the world outside the story. There is a particular pleasure, easy to underestimate, in simply holding one of these old magazines or standing before a preserved cover behind exhibition glass and recognizing the shape of something still very much alive in modern storytelling. The typography looks dated now. The rocket designs look almost quaint against what real spacecraft turned out to look like. But the emotional promise printed across that cover of a road opening between the reader's ordinary evening and some impossibly distant elsewhere has not dated at all. It is the same promise a modern audience feels sitting down with a new game or a new film that assumes, without pausing to argue the point, that ships can cross the gulf between stars in roughly the time it takes to tell a story. The costume has changed a great deal. The invitation printed underneath it has not changed at all. That may be the truest thing left to say about faster-than-light travel after tracing it through pseudoscience and fan letters, through wartime urgency and literary doubt, through the sobering weight of relativity itself. It never became real, and by the honest reckoning of physics as currently understood, it likely never will. But it did become something nearly as durable, a shared imaginative habit handed down deliberately or accidentally from one generation of readers and writers to the next, refined in arguments nobody thought were historically important at the time, preserved not because anyone expected it to matter later, but because a handful of careful custodians decided that fragile paper deserved saving anyway. Long before it was a technology anyone seriously hoped to build, faster-than-light travel was a literary corridor, built page by page, argument by argument, cover by cover, out of borrowed physics and honest invention and the patient goodwill of readers willing to believe for the length of a story. People have been walking that corridor ever since, carrying forward the same old hope for a shortcut between distant lights, and that hope, more than any diagram or design, is what has actually lasted. It seems as good a thought as any to carry now, gently, toward the end of this evening's journey through star roads that were never meant to be real, only to be believed in for a little while.